Thank you all for coming. Hopefully you're not too exhausted by this point. Plenary session is a session both with interesting and cutting-edge papers, but also an opportunity to talk. So we're going to leave plenty of time as well. The panel's going to leave plenty of time for conversations afterwards. I just want to make a couple announcements before I introduce the panel. There have been found some glasses and an umbrella, which are right here, if those are yours at some point. And the other thing is that following the plenary session is a short 15-minute break, and then the hip-hop performance, poetry performance. And I wanted to let you know that the three talented performers in the hip-hop performance are also performing in a concert in Hamra, in our neighborhood, on Saturday night at a club. All right. At a club called the Democratic Republic of Music, DRM. It's a show that says it begins at 8, which probably means 10. So there'll be plenty of time after the day trip on Saturday. We are all invited. You can buy tickets at the door. And the DRM, the best thing to do, because I can't give you precise directions right now, it's only about a block or two from the UB, is to go online and Google the Democratic Republic of Music, and they will find it. Okay, now I'm pleased to introduce session 11, our plenary session, which is titled Contesting the Foreign-Domestic Divide, Arab Revolutions and American Studies. I'm just going to introduce the panelists, and then I'm going to turn it over to them, and they will fool themselves. And they're going to speak in the order that they appear in the conference book. So first is Rabab Abdul-Hadi, who will be talking about contesting foreign-domestic divide, Arab revolutions and American studies. Monami Malik, Islamophobia in U.S. social movements, nonprofit industrial complex and state of mass organizing under Obama. Melissa Garcia, at checkpoints, visual regimes of border crossing in Mexico and Palestine. Jaime Bebe, Tercer Mundo Otra Vez, Latin America and Arab Africa, and Asian challenges to neoliberalism. My Spanish pronunciation is much better than my Arabic pronunciation. And Ruth Wilson Gilmore, Organization, Uprising, and Anti-State State. Please help me welcome to the session.
Good afternoon. I'm actually extremely pleased to be in Beirut, and AUB, some of the stuff that was mentioned last night also alerts to the fact that this is one of the major sites for intellectual and oppositional thought. This is where you will find intellectuals and oppositional movements from all over the Arab world. It's particularly a pleasure, particularly with this panel. So I would like to, I'm going to be talking about the stuff that Alex mentioned, and let me start. And usually I will take time to it, but I'm not going to. Okay. So in an email to ASA Council and President, American Studies Association, I made several suggestions regarding the developments in the Arab world, namely the uprisings and the WikiLeaks Palestine papers, including I suggested that we have two panels, one on Palestine, one on Arab developments, an immediate campus educational campaign teach-ins, resource materials, speakers, maybe possibly an American quarterly issue on these topics, and possibly putting together a fact-finding mission to the region to meet with oppositional movements, especially scholars at universities and research movements. This is because, as you know, the invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq and the continuing wars would not have been possible, the reason, if the US had been better informed of and allied with Arab anti-colonial and anti-imperialist movements, instead of receiving information mostly from US media and Israeli centrist forces, and of course centrist, where the center, right, and left are located on the political spectrum, is always relative to the context we're talking about. In response to my email, a member of the council and a past ASA president, not Ruthie Gilmore, basically shut down every single idea I proposed. And he basically ASA said, and I quote, that it seems to me that ASA might play a role by helping publicize the teach-ins, he said they couldn't do teach-ins, that have been organized at various universities on the American Studies listserv. I actually did send an announcement of one of the first teachings in the US we did, which was entitled What's Going On in the Arab World, a teaching on Arab uprisings in Southwest Asia and North Africa. However, the moderator of the American Studies HNet listserv refused to post the announcement. He replied that the American Studies list is for topics on American culture, and I'd understand that our announcement would not be included. Right? The person, the member of the council and the past ASA president listed other things commenting on my proposal. On the question of fact-finding, I'm actually quoting directly, of the fact-finding mission, that is not something that we have done, nor are we likely to pursue. ASA members are, of course, free to engage in such activities as individual scholars and citizens. But for ASA, as an organization with limited resources, to embark on such a fact-finding mission would be seen by many within and outside the organization as at odds with our mission as an academic organization. So it's not academic. He also said, in addition to the resource issue, ASA cannot presume to speak for its members, which undoubtedly has different viewpoints, points of view on the role of ASA and on the politics of the Middle East. If we did this, we would make ourselves vulnerable to polarizing debates, both within and outside our organization, that we are ill-equipped to deal with. I think he was basically alluding a bit to the question of Palestine and the whole, we talk about that later. Thankfully, Ruthie Gilmore, who was still president of ASA, did not share these views, and she in fact helped facilitate the panels on Arab revolutions at the last ASA. So what I want to talk about is why I think that actually these are academic concerns that should belong to the American studies, and in particular to critical ethnic studies within American studies, or maybe intersecting with American studies, however we want to talk about. And why people in the United States, as well as scholars in the US, should not limit their engagement to issues that happen within, quote-unquote, the borders of the United States, but are extending beyond it. I think there are three different publics, at least, who are very much concerned with these issues within the US, and maybe outside as well. Arab and Muslim communities at home and in the diaspora, to whom the Arab world represents the ancestral homeland, as well as the current home of their relatives and extended families. To the US government that has its own interests and designs for the region, this is another concern, and for instance, the US Academy, within the Academy in particular, Middle East Studies is seen as the most appropriate site for the study of social change and social revolutions in the Arab world. And of course, finally, foreign policy experts, pundits who always are on TV giving their opinions, a lot of the time unfounded, they populate a Washington think tank and are considered legitimate sources of knowledge production on the streets of Arab Street. In all these renditions, American studies and critical ethnic studies is not seen as an authoritative site for knowledge production, as the moderator of the HNet, the American studies said that they deal with American culture and things of this sort, like quote-unquote fluffy things. And the other sort of solid things should belong in the Middle East. The exclusion of critical ethnic studies is, as a legitimate and an authoritative source of community-centered and community-relevant knowledge production is based on three problematic notions. One, the lack of expertise that assumes that knowledge of African or Asian or Latin American affairs belongs to foreign policy and Middle East experts. Two, lack of time, because indigenous communities and communities of color have a lot on their plates, such as unemployment, crime, and other so-called symptoms of the cultural poverty paradigm, and thus do not have the time to deal with luxury items, intellectual luxury items, such as socioeconomic and political developments on the other side of the world. And three, an implicit assumption that indigenous communities and communities of color must limit their concerns to the domestic US, to concerns within domestic borders and thus domestic US affairs, but not in foreign policy that belong outside of the US borders and outside of their immediate concerns. I find all these hegemonic assumptions unfounded. On a most basic level, indigenous communities and communities of color, like other people in the US have every right to hold their government accountable to what it does in their name. It is illogical to expect these communities, as well as other people in the US, to pay taxes, vote, and participate in all affairs of state, and then be disqualified from the right to participate in the decision-making processes that affect them and their children the most. This is most evident in the case of the current US wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, whereby young women and men from indigenous communities and communities of color are economically drafted into US military as a gateway to a better future because of the lack of opportunities in civilian life. Secondly, the US government has a long reach all over the world. To suggest that US citizens should only focus on domestic affairs, quote unquote, in effect calls for the domestication of communities of color, a patronizing proposition at best, and a racist argument at worst. And this is something that Malcolm X actually talked about when he discusses field slaves and house slaves. Suggesting that communities of color and indigenous communities have no expertise in international affairs defies history. That reminds us that the only people living in the United States who do not come from international sites are native nations. Everyone else comes from elsewhere, most often without having a choice in the matter, but rather as a direct result of being kidnapped and enslaved, exploited workers, indentured labor, or because of manifest destiny and US imperialist designs. In fact, historical evidence shows that the first Africans to be kidnapped from their communities and enslaved in the Americas were Muslims. Writing Quranic verses on the walls of their cells, which were incomprehensible to the slave masters, they enacted the mantra to not forget one's name or where he came from long before Alex Haley's Roots was published. More recent evidence, and this would represent the earliest probably diaspora in the US. Most recent evidence can be seen and reinforces this argument in the work of W.E.B. Du Bois, Marcus Garvey in the late 19th and 20th century, Richard Wright and James Baldwin in the mid-20th century, the struggle for the liberation of Puerto Rico from the late 19th century on, the call of the brown berets to draft moratorium, the Black Panthers seeking refuge in Algeria, or the way in which Malcolm X internationalized the African-American struggle and defined it in terms of international human rights in the 1960s. Finally, insisting on distance and detachment that has long been discredited in the social sciences and the humanities, and thus should not be seen as disqualifying ethnic studies, a field that recognizes and validates the lived experiences of marginalized communities and places them at the center of analysis. Historically, indigenous communities, communities of color, and poor and marginalized communities have been at the first to express opposition to US wars, whether in Vietnam or in the aftermath of the World Trade Center bombing in 2001. In addition, as it was historically envisioned and as developed to this very day, ethnic studies has been a site at which the academy and the community come together to produce justice-centered knowledge and allow for the emergence of alternative pedagogies that center people's lived experiences and aspirations at the center of its mission. Finally, Arab revolutions are not taking place in a vacuum. They are situated in North Africa and Southwest Asia, thus referring to Arab and Muslim communities and Arab American and Arab Asian countries, rather than the Orientalist and colonialist term middle of the East, to whom and for whom, certainly not for the people who live at the center of it, only serves to lift Arabs from their continents, Africa and Asia, and displaces them onto an intellectual space that is both alienating and inhospitable to their dreams and aspirations, defined by their colonists and superimposed on their lived realities. So then it becomes a different kind of space to which people do not relate and do not see Arabs coming from Asia and Africa as part of people from the third world going, for instance, to the Americas. So their affairs remain in the Middle East, a distant and very alienating place. Finally, the central role, and I want to come back to that, the US government and state has historically played and continues to play as a major factor from the sympathies towards the Zionist project, which I'd like to argue stems from the similarities between US and Israel as settler colonial states, and not only as the result of lobbying or diplomatic relations of US presidents by different Zionist envoys, because this is the way the diplomatic history goes. Rather, I think the openness to lobbying has everything to do with the fact that both US and Israel are settler colonial states with similar, if not identical, histories, ideologies towards the indigenous populations. In addition, there is also various interventions that I've talked about But I also want to talk about like the way in which US and Israel, specifically Israel as being the anti of the Arab revolutions as Israel, is from enlisting Moshe Dayan, the former defense minister of Israel, to go to Vietnam to aid the US, getting Ariel Sharon, the former prime minister of Israel, to teach the US about the Palestinization of the indigenous population in Guatemala. And of course, most recently, which I think Melissa will be talking about, the question of the Israeli company that is actually building the apartheid wall in Palestine and the wall of death between US and Mexico. So there is a lot of other examples that we can discuss. Okay, so if this is the picture from, how much time? Am I still okay? Okay. So if this is I was actually going to end here and not just make the final thing, but then I thought, if we're talking about the picture that looks like, if we shift location, and rather than looking at US and American studies and critical ethnic studies from an Arab-centered anti-imperialist perspective, and look at critical ethnic studies, critical race theory prism, to Arab conceptualization of America, right, and Americanness, what would it look like? Okay, so I'm going to just like give a couple of examples and then wrap up. So in the first step of a collaborative project between the Center of Arab American Studies, which I directed at the University of Michigan, Dearborn, with the Palestinian University, I was repeatedly asked, every time I went somewhere, where is American? Where is American? Where are the Americans? Now the group was made up of an African American, South Asian, West Indian professors of Indian descent, along with an Iraqi lawyer and a young Mexican American student intern. I kept being asked, where are the Americans? And this is the Americans. Where are the Americans? This is the Americans. Okay, nobody accepted that. And I've been perplexed by it, and I think I shared this with people before, but not here, that it was very difficult for the Palestinian colleagues to reconcile the hegemonic image of Americanness they have in their imaginary with the group that came with me. I don't think it's unexpected for people outside of the US, even with a black president that we have now, to fit this understanding of the history of struggle of indigenous, African American, other marginalized communities of which they are aware with the hegemonic image of Americanness. We are all aware of the struggle of, for instance, the indigent in France, which Horia Bouteja speaks about. But when we think of the word French, we do not think of the people, the formerly colonized people, who are living at the heart of the empire. We think of the French as the French. There is the French, real French, and there is the French, other French, okay? And the same thing with American or Arab American, for instance, or African American, and so on. And we've been confronted with this a lot, actually, in Palestine on our various trips. So how do we deal with this? How do we recognize in our discourses and scholarship the diversity of people who inhabit the US and at the same time think about and not let go of the question of the hegemonic notions of Americans that continue to permeate our spaces and actually subjugate us, at the very least mentally, but in all sorts of other ways. I think that way, and I'm saying some things that I believe people already know, but let me just like share them at the risk of repeating myself. One is that when we think about America, it's really important to keep reminding ourselves that we talk about the Americas, North and South, the Western Hemisphere, and the US does not become America. And people, specifically scholars from Latin America and the Caribbean, are extremely incensed when we continue saying American is the same as somebody from the United States. And this also calls for who is a citizen, who is not a citizen, and so on, especially with the question of undocumented and the large number of people who are coming and who are being persecuted. To talk about citizenship implies somebody who has citizenship, a passport, and so on. So we need to also think beyond those kind of confines. Secondly, acknowledging the diversity, both in indigenous communities of color and the dominance of a particular image of Americanness. Third, when we think about Arab American, usually people think of it as Arab American diplomatic relations. Arab American are people who are Arabs who live in the United States. Some people identify as American, some people identify as Arab living in the US, not Arab American, because they want to displace the Americanness in this sense. Should not refer to the diplomatic thing, but also to Arab diasporas in the Americas. And that not all Arabs in the US are eager to follow the conventional assimilationist model of Ezra Parks and the Chicago School, but that Arabs who are US citizens, like US citizens of other communities, will never achieve complete citizenship as long as US remains as it is today. In other words, an unachievable citizenship, no matter how many flags people place on their cars, in their houses, on their bodies, in their cars, and everywhere. For this reason, then, the domestic-foreign divide does not work. More appropriately is a framework in which one recognizes the workings and the structures of power and domination, as well as looks for resistance, and I'm not being utopian here, and I'm not pushing for something that does not exist, for resistance, and place it at the center, and place justice at the center of analysis. To sum up then, I am arguing against the whole question of the foreign domestic, that if you do that, then you actually lose track of trying to think about, let's say, horizontal ways of resistance and activism against sort of like, you know, bodies that are dominating. Second is the question of diversity, both of people in the United States. So when we say American, we don't think of one particular body of Americanness, or we think of Arab as not one person that embodies Arabness, but there is a diversity. But also the structures of power are really important. And thirdly, to think about the question of the US role, understanding the injustice, and understanding that people are complicit and culpable in all the policies that the US pursues. So if people see these policies and continue to not do anything about them, we will be complicit. And it goes the same thing here. Now, if we know in the Arab world that there is diversity in the US, and we continue to say American, as American, and the independence, and this country has achieved all democratic things, and so on, it's very problematic. It makes it impossible to build alliances, and principled alliances, towards questions of self-determination and justice. So, if we don't want to be complicit, we really need to think about the question of the indivisibility of justice, which was actually the most important contribution of Martin Luther King to humanity. Thank you.
So my talk has changed slightly from the, I think, title I originally put. So what I'm going to talk about is more closer to talking about the U.S. war on terror, anti-capitalist movements in the U.S. and globally, and racial justice organizing right now in the U.S. And I'm going to speak not as an academic or student, which I haven't been in many years, but I'm a community organizer for 15 years in New York City. And I started an organization when I was 25 called DRUM, Desi's Rising Up and Moving. Desi means people of South Asian descent. So our membership, we have 1,200 members across New York City who are low-wage workers, undocumented, primarily Muslim. And there are people who are mainly from Bangladesh, from Pakistan, Guyana, Trinidad, India, more recently from Nepal. In New York City right now, there are over 1 million South Asians, mostly people who are working in low-wage service sectors. Our members are cab drivers, they're domestic workers, they're restaurant and retail workers, and day laborers. We are a membership-led organization, which is different from a lot of advocacy and policy and activist organizations in the US, in the sense that our vision is that it's low-wage workers, low-income people, young people who have the analysis and the strategy, and we are facilitators in bringing that out, and they should have the power to take action to challenge and change institutions. Some of our main campaigns over the last decade have been around ending racial profiling, national campaigns against the use of informants in the Muslim community, ending the school-to-prison pipeline that increasingly our young people are a part of, migrant workers' rights, and legalization while fighting increased deportation and militarization of the border, as well as taking on global issues like the wars abroad and Palestine. When the organization started in the 1990s, pre-9/11 era, there was already a context why we needed to start as a growing population of low-wage migrants, low-wage Muslim migrants in the US, and the communities that we were finding ourselves in. And it's to really counter the narrative that's come about right now in the US that everything began on 9/11 for the Muslim community, or for people of color, or for workers in general. These were issues that we know in the working class South Asian communities in New York existed for a long time, and particularly in the 1990s. When I grew up in the Bronx, it was an era of, within New York, I grew up in the area of Giuliani time, where there was rampant police brutality and abuse, but there was also a response and a politicization of young people of color in the US. Hip-hop played a big role in that in the early 90s. It was a time of increased criminalization of people of color, the prison industrial complex, with over 2 million, mostly black and brown prisoners, one of the largest prison systems in the US. It was also the time that broken windows policy got passed in New York City public schools. When I grew up, there were no such thing as police officers and metal detectors and precincts in the basements of schools. Now it's a common thing. The police department stationed inside of schools in New York is larger than the top 3 police departments of the US combined. And so that era, we really saw a rapid criminalization of communities of color. And it was at the same time that you had a mass wave of hundreds of thousands of South Asian migrant workers, particularly to places like New York, to fill low-wage service sector jobs. So we started in that context, and then 9/11 hit after that. But before it hit, we were already understood the need to organize within detention centers, within public schools, with working class Muslim and South Asian youth and youth of color. And our key strategy has been around mass-based organizing, direct action, and linking everything we do around challenging US policies to the foreign policies they're connected to. So I'm going to talk first a little bit about the decade of 9/11, Islamophobia, and how it basically has become a new face of age-old institutions of racism. When 9/11 happened, up and from that point until 2003, the main thing that was happening on the ground that I worked with, that my comrades worked with, is just the mass arrest of thousands of young men, people who were like, that I called uncles growing up, cab drivers, gas station workers, rounded up, deported, detained, and then the other little known fact of thousands of predominantly Pakistani and Bangladeshi families who fled to the Canadian border into Canada to avoid arrest and detention, and subsequently were deported back in the thousands between 2003 and 2005 back to the US. So in that era, we did a lot of stuff on the ground. We ran hotlines, did outreach in the jails, assisted families, did action alerts, supported prisoners doing hunger strikes, took up families and women to take leadership in the media, to talk about the disappearances of their loved ones, built community self-defense networks and the models we had learned of in the 1960s that the Panthers and other forces in New York were doing against heavy repression in the era of COINTELPRO. What happened after that, though, I mean, that's the part that a lot of people know about. What happened afterwards was a slow shift in domestic policy against Muslims and under the war on terror. And it began in 2003 or 4 with the formation of the DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, out of what used to be called the Immigration and Naturalization Service. This was really pivotal for many of us who do immigrant rights struggle, racial justice struggle in the US, because for the first time, it permanently linked the issue of immigration to the issue of terrorism and national security. And this is not just a US thing, but this was something that was done explicitly to export as a model of controlling migrant labor and controlling resistance around the world. So, I've been to a lot of meetings with migrant leaders from Asia, Africa, Latin America, who talk about the same exact national security policies that we have in the US being used against migrant workers going from Bangladesh to the Philippines, being used against Haitian workers coming into the Dominican Republic from Haiti, that migrants and workers and resistance movements are all being labeled and called terrorists or national security threats. And the other side of that has been it's used as a reason to further exploit and repress the entire immigration military-industrial complex. So you have secret sort of detention centers and facilities in Mexico now using the national security paradigm, where before there was some sort of way to organize and hold accountable the Mexican government for the masses of folks crossing through Mexico into the US and facing a lot of repression. But now there are national security detention facilities that you can't question them, lawyers can't go inside, and it basically disallows any kind of organizing against the growing immigration regime. After this shift, in 2007, there was something else we saw that started with a report in New York City by the NYPD, New York City Police Department, called Radicalization in the West. And subsequently, this is something that became national policy, the entire narrative of the homegrown terrorists, domestic radicalization. You have the rise of fusion centers, the use of informants, FBI entrapments, surveillance in mosques and cafes, community groups like us, the building of CMUs, or communication management unit prisons that warehouse Muslims entrapped alongside black radical prisoners and environmental activists. An example is one of our core leaders for the last 10 years, a woman named Shahina Perveen, who's really been courageous and at the forefront as a mother of a victim of this NYPD entrapment, Siraj Mateen. And this story, I'll quickly say, it highlights how the government is going after the most vulnerable people to justify its broader agenda at home and abroad. Siraj Mateen was one of the first really publicized cases of homegrown terrorism, somebody who was convicted during the Republican National Conventions in New York City. He was arrested as the Herald Square bomber. He was approached by a paid NYPD informant, basically who befriended him for a period of 2 years. Siraj was, I think, 19 when the informant met him. He's undocumented, he's mentally challenged, and he worked 7 days a week in a bookstore in Brooklyn and lived in Queens near our office. This informant worked on him. This informant fed him a lot of anger, fed him a lot of basically what he should do and how he should do it. Mateen never agreed to do anything, but in court, none of the full versions of the tapes were not played. Only select pieces of the audio was played that made the government's case, as all these cases are conducted in the same way. Well, Mateen was convicted to 30 years in prison. He spent a lot of those years in a CMU in Indiana. Now he's been moved to upstate New York, where his mother could at least see him. Since then, there have been numerous other cases of entrapments like this. And Mateen's mother always says, whenever she does public talks as a leader, everywhere, that she understands her son was a scapegoat, and she understands the bigger agenda of the US in manufacturing terrorists is to justify its wars abroad and its occupations abroad. And I've always thought it's very courageous of her to see far beyond the entrapment and the loss of her son to see the bigger picture of what's happening. So all of this to say that in doing this work on the ground for the last decade, one thing that's clear is that none of this is anything new, that this is a new era of criminalization of an internal community of color to justify US domestic and foreign policy. In the 1980s, I grew up under what was called the war on drugs, at the same time that the US was conducting covert wars against socialist movements in Central America. In the 1990s, with the war on crime, the same decade that NAFTA and free trade agreements are passed, the border wall is built, prisons are expanding, and you need a justification of this mushrooming prison, military, enforcement industrial complex. And now you have the war on terror with Muslims, Arabs, and South Asians as the new face, the new criminal, the new terrorists, but kind of the same old game of military, policing, industrial complexes at home and abroad. Within this, how has the left or social movements responded is something I want to touch on. So one thing that's been really problematic in doing this work is that the construction of what is Islamophobia has been heavily financed by liberal sort of NGO interests in the US, and often devoid of rooting in material, race, and class analysis, and it privileges identity politics often over a critique of state violence. An example of this is that millions of dollars of funding goes into bias crime legislation and bias crime work, rather than challenging policing, prisons, deportations, and relying on solutions to then criminalize other communities of color fighting each other, and justification to bring in more cops into schools, more police into our neighborhoods to fight individual-based bias crimes. A second example is, I've heard this talked about on other panels, is the sort of co-optation and a creation of a Muslim, quote-unquote, leadership that becomes the gatekeeper with government institutions and the collaborating force at home. I have many colleagues of other organizations who've created, or the other Muslim civil rights organizations in the city, who have all been fellows in the State Department, who've all traveled Europe and been the faces of Muslim relations within the US. And many of these are the same people that for the last 10 years within New York are the first ones to invite the FBI into our community, to invite the NYPD into our mosques, to recruit for the CIA from our youth, to bring in informants, basically, and to want to demand to sit at the table to negotiate in a game where we have absolutely no power. So besides the NGO sort of labeling of Islamophobia, another major challenge in doing this work and the way it's constructed right now is the silencing of Muslim, Arab, and South Asian groups, particularly fighting these issues domestically, to have any particular stance or position on foreign policy, on US wars, occupation, and definitely not Palestine. And so there's many countless examples of this. Even left social movement spaces like the US Social Forum have been very full of a lot of problematic sort of deprioritizing of challenging the wars abroad, challenging, raising issues of Palestine as central themes, especially under the era of Obama. And I'll tell you, in the first, in the Bush years, in the first 8 years, those 8 years, there was a rise of understanding the issues in the Middle East and a solidarity with organizations, with Muslim, Arab, South Asian organizations on these issues. And as soon as Obama's election happened, there was a gag order put out around, especially the nonprofit-funded social movements, to not talk about those issues anymore, and to only talk about domestic issues. And so it's been really tough in this new era to, as Muslim, Arab, and South Asian organizations that have an analysis about the wars abroad. And lastly, another problematic thing has been the force to de-link Muslim struggles in the US from other community of color struggles. And this doesn't come just by chance. This comes by explicit, often, directive from Ford Foundation, from Carnegie, from Rockefeller, from various foundations, that I've been to many meetings where they sit you down and they say, they put PR firms in front of you, throw millions of dollars and say, we will give you this money if you do X, Y, and Z. And some of those X, Y, and Z's are: 1, do not ever call this racism. 2, stay away from the history of racial profiling or racism in the Black community. 3, don't call yourselves immigrants, call yourselves Muslim Americans, and never talk about the hundreds of thousands of Muslim undocumented workers in the US. So those are the conditions under which you can organize in a civil rights framework in the US. So finally, kind of to say to where to go with all this, for us it's basically been sticking to a politics or bringing back a politics of solidarity amongst people of color within the US, an anti-imperialist analysis, and an internationalism, particularly as Muslim, Arab, and South Asian organizations that are strongly being pulled towards an agenda that's for the US empire. the very same people that are challenging the war on terror within the US. And so we seek to, at every moment we can, root the war on terror as repression, not only of Muslims, but of people who are against the US empire-building agenda, workers, anti-capitalist struggle, poor peoples, indigenous struggles within the US and globally, that we need to and encourage rooting the war on terror within US social control that uses Muslims to justify ongoing increasing imprisoning, social control and disenfranchising of poor people of color, particularly Black and now Latinos as majority. And this is something kind of controversial in certain Muslim civil rights circles in the US, but the reality is that the billions of dollars going into national security infrastructure in the US, the largest sort of victims and the largest ways that that oppression comes down on the ground is still the 2 million predominantly Black and Latino people in prison, the over 4,000 Latino and Mexican migrants who crossed and died at the border because of militarization, and more recently with the incarceration of Muslims. But often that broader context of where the same old enforcement is happening is not talked about in funded civil rights circles. And lastly, we really project the need to dismantle the US war machine at home and globally, not only in the arena of challenging war and national security regimes, but by centralizing anti-capitalist, anti-neoliberal movements, global migrant workers movements, indigenous resistance, as all ultimate targets of the war on terror, and whatever the next era of repression or resistance would be called. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. I just wanted to quickly thank all of you, the organizers. We've been here 2 days, but I felt incredibly welcome. You're great hosts, so I just wanted to say thank you. Anyways, what I'm going to be talking about right now has a lot to do, it's almost like a branch of what Monami just explained in great detail of all the work that civil rights organizations and organizers in the US are doing at present. What I'm going to focus on is on this idea of borders. Like, I'm going to use this opportunity to perhaps explore, and maybe in the Q&A we can talk a little bit more about that. What are the limitations, what are the advantages, what can we gain out of playing with this framework of border studies. I personally studied the border, the US-Mexico border, not the only one, but I am familiar with that, that's my research, and today I'm gonna bring some aspects of that right next to the borders between Israel and Palestine. So I am Ecuadorian, even though I live in the US, and every time I go back to Ecuador, or every time I travel to Latin America, I hear, whenever there is a conversation about Palestine, I hear Mexicans are the Palestinians of the US, right? And it's something that people, it can be interpreted in many ways depending on where you are hearing this, but in Latin America, it's not meant to be a derogatory comparison. It's actually an expression of solidarity. It's not, perhaps in the US, because Mexicans are being constructed as something less than, maybe in the US there might be some response related to that. But in Latin America, or at least in my experience, it's actually a sentence that, an expression that is reflecting the many, many years in which Palestine and the plight of Palestinians have been operated in the historical imagination of people living in the Americas. So I just wanted to mention that because as Rabab was saying, and Monami also was explaining, right, there are lots of connections, right, that most of the time go unnoticed. And the fact that they go unnoticed is not, it's part of the methodical way in which settler colonialism works. So when we're talking about Mexicans, I have to be very clear that I'm talking about a particular group of Mexicans, right? Poor poor, dark skin, usually with identifiable indigenous features, categories that go hand in hand with a more historical framework of overlapping colonizations, overlapping occupations. If I can mention 1492 as a point of reference, right, the various occupiers in the same, let's say, the same area, right, going from one state to the other, and in this context, borders are inventions, as we all know, these fictions, right, that change and that are upon the dominion of power. They're always changing, right? And even if the appearance of borders is one that is fixation, right? When we look at the landscape even, the landscape changes, right? So for instance, in the US-Mexico border here, I guess it's not, but anyways, in the US-Mexico border, one of the big markers, right? It's a river, Rio Grande, right? And I'm thinking in the Middle East, right, all those markers that historically have been used, right, to identify certain groups or certain regions and experiences people within those. So here I wanted to talk about the wall, right, because the wall is perhaps the most paradigmatic visual figure, right, that we can see when somebody who has been to the US-Mexico border, when we go to see the wall in Palestine, we have this eerie sensation that we have been here before, right? It's not just based on the physical, the tangible aspects of the wall. The wall, as you probably know, in Israel and in occupied Palestine and Israel companies are the ones that are being hired to do that, and the same companies are the ones that are being used to, hired to do the wall in the US-Mexico border. So that's not a coincidence, right? But aside from those markers, those physical markers, what is important to recognize, at least in my opinion, is this idea that the wall brings back memories, historical memories of successive occupations, right? That if we go back and we see the similarities, or at least the intersections by which these share histories of oppression, right? Then the wall becomes not only what it means, right? The imprisonment, the incarceration of populations, the control, the shaping of identities, the daily violence, right? All those obviously urgent, visible experiences, but it also brings this idea of shared historical experiences of various groups. So here I have a couple, I mean, maybe it's not that clear, but for those of you who have been there, you can see that in the wall, right, like here you have things in Spanish, and then we have here the yes we can, I have a dream, like there is a variety of creative expressions that have been posted in there, and the same happens in the US-Mexico wall, which I don't know why it's not here, but anyway, so that's one thing, right? But then, so the wall is there, right? It's fixed. And now when we think about checkpoints, right? Checkpoints, I bring checkpoints here, the figure of the checkpoints to explore, because checkpoints are like a ramification, right, of the wall. Checkpoints are both the figure and the actual construction, the actual structure, the actual organization that makes the wall mobile, right? Checkpoints appear at any time, unexpectedly. Checkpoints open, checkpoints close, sometimes pass through the checkpoints in a relatively easy way. Sometimes you don't know how long you're going to stay at the checkpoints, right? So, and checkpoints are also, wait, here. This is something to do with checkpoint. And then I have a variety of photographs here that I wanted to just show, because at some point you don't recognize where this is, right? Because they share a particular aesthetic in terms of control, right? The cameras, the soldiers showing their guns, right? The lining people waiting. You see here the barbed wire, right? all these elements that are highly recognizable. And as I said, anybody who has been to the US-Mexico border, it's very hard to place where this is, right? Okay, so why am I saying all this, right? Why am I putting together the checkpoint and the very specific history and the very specific conditions that are going on in Palestine, right, with the US-Mexico border? Because as we can see, there are two, when we look at the US-Mexico border, we're clearly, seemingly, seeing two different nationalities, right? And then when we look at the case of Israel-Palestine, we know that it's way more complex than that, right? People are not crossing in terms of, they're crossing in terms of where do they live, how do they look like, right? The humiliation that they are being exposed to, all that. But if we're thinking about a regime by which people are being incarcerated, by which people are being controlled, regulated, the idea, the figure of the checkpoint is something that theoretically may be useful to think about, say, some developments, some processes in the United States. And why do I say that? Because usually when we look at border theory, right, or at least border theory that has been constructed in the US-Mexico border, there are like two camps. The ones that say, it's the empirical conditions, the ones that matter, and the ones that say, no, it's the metaphorical, the identity crossing, the kind of concepts that allowed us to cross borders in a seemingly fluid way. Somebody earlier was talking about this, and I think that we're all clear of the dangers of talking about, borders being flexible, as if, everybody holds multiple passports, right? That people can cross freely from anywhere they like. That whole triumphal narrative of, global, without borders, sort of world, we all are, I think, are familiar with that, with the dangers of that trope. However, what I wanted to suggest today is perhaps, and to see if we can actually use some of the work that has been done in border theory, perhaps to use this idea of flexibility and mobility to bring the checkpoints far from the wall in the US-Mexico side. Why do I say this? Mona mentioned some of the conditions by which US immigrants in the US live right now, right? And then something that for me was quite eerie when the first time I visited Palestine was to see like some of the very, not just the wall or the checkpoints or like the uniforms and the whole landscape, right? The visual landscape of what's going here, but also the way in which intimate life, ordinary life, at every single aspect is so methodically thought to torture the other. Now, undocumented immigrants in the United States from all over the world, but mostly people of color, because they can be identified as others and they are being profiled based on their appearance, right? They are living, right, without documents outside of the law, and they're being subjected to similar tactics. Rapes, unexpected rapes in their own homes at 5 o'clock in the morning, taking the father or the mother in front of their children and leaving the children not knowing where the parents are for a few days. Terrorizing people outside of schools. People bring their kids to schools and then they are taking them and deporting them, or sometimes imprison them for a week or two with no communication whatsoever because they are not citizens. They don't have the rights that citizenship should afford, like the right to a lawyer and all that. To hospitals, right? To places of education, to in roads. Undocumented immigrants at any time in any public train, public bus can be stopped and asked for documents. And as you probably are familiar, in some states in the US, the effort to pass legislation that is even harsher than that is very much alive, especially in times of electoral politics, right, as we are right now. However, I want to emphasize how the idea of the checkpoint, right, that unexpected encounter with authority that puts your life at risk, right, the risk of deportation, that means separation of families, not knowing when you're going to see your father, your mother, your son, your 5-year-old daughter, right, all that constant terrorizing that is based on uncertainty. I I argue that that those methods are quite calculated in terms of dealing with what is seen as an excess population. And this is the part that I find that is eerie, considering all the historical specificities of Palestinians and Mexican immigrants right now, but that theoretically it allows us to perhaps see borders, the mobility of borders, not as a triumphal sort of crossing identities from one to the other in a very cosmopolitan, metropolitan sort of way, but to see beyond the wall and beyond the checkpoint and to see where all those power structures are being reproduced, sometimes in places that we don't have access to, like your house at 5 o'clock in the morning, right? Or like going to the supermarket, and at the exit of the supermarket there's a raid, and they're taking all people who look like Mexicans. And here I have to say who look like Mexicans, because people that go and cross the border, right? They're not just Mexicans, they're people who travel all the way from South America, the Caribbean, and other places by sea and by land in order to cross, right? And the difference is that perhaps for immigrants, there is like a once in a lifetime or 2 or 3 times, like exceptional times, and Palestinians do it in an ordinary way, right? But what I'm proposing here is to see, to kind of like address those structures that are being imposed by power, right? How power and authority travel so easily to all aspects of life, and perhaps use that also as an opportunity to see what are the sites of resistance that are occurring, not just at the checkpoint, but also in more intimate, in more ordinary places, like the family, like school, right? Like lovers, right? Like all these more ethereal ways by which we look at. And I know I don't have time anymore, right? Okay, so maybe the Q&A, I had 2 very specific examples, anecdotes if you like, of examples of how sometimes I see, you know, in the surprise of ordinariness of life, kind of like finding acts of resistance that because of our traps in area studies that we see, you know, this has to be for Mexicans, this has to be for Muslims, this has to be for all these categories that are trapped, are part of colonial legacies, right? That because of those categories, sometimes we don't see the shared experience that we all have, even though, right, we might be experiencing, we might experience oppression differently, but we can all recognize, and you know, this is perhaps an attempt to bring attention to those sites that we tend, epistemologically speaking, to, you know, they tend to go unnoticed. So since I know that many of us here are scholars, that's also something that I feel that it's important to just bring up. But as I said, I can talk more about that.